Best-selling books in the year you were born, coming up. Hey guys, welcome back to Book Your Imagination. My name is Anne. This is the third video on my series called Best-Selling Books in the Year You Were Born. I'm doing them by decade, and I started the first video with the 1980s. The second video was the 1990s, and that's because I think most people on BookTube and YouTube were born in the 80s and 90s. But if you were born in the 1970s, then this video is for you. In the 80s and 90s, there were two authors who absolutely dominated the best-selling charts, Stephen King and Danielle Steel. In the 80s, Stephen King had 12 books and Danielle Steel had 10 books on the best-selling list. In the 90s, Stephen King had 13 books and Danielle Steel had 20 books on the best-selling list. 20 books. That's amazing. You know how many books any one author had in the 70s? 3. No one dominated in the 70s like these two did in the 80s and 90s. There were only 6 authors who had books on the best-selling list 3 times, and those authors were Robert Ludlum, Kurt Vonnegut, James A. Michener, Arthur Haley, John le Carré, and Frederick Forsyth. But that doesn't mean that there were no great books in the 70s. There may not have been anyone who dominated the 70s, but there really were some outstanding books that came out of that decade. Before we get started, I just want to remind you, these are adult fiction. They're based on sales in the U.S. only, and these are books on the best-selling list in the year they were published, not any subsequent years. So now let's get into it. If you were born in 1970, the number 5 book is Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. At number 4, Mary Stewart wrote The Crystal Cave. Ernest Hemingway is number 3 with Islands in the Stream. Now you might be saying, I thought Hemingway was dead. And you would be right. He died in 1961. This is the first posthumously published book of his. It was actually written in 1950 and 1951. At number 2, The French Lieutenant's Woman by John Fowles, and the number 1 book in 1970 was Love Story by Eric Siegel. Also published in 1970, Irwin Shaw wrote Rich Man, Poor Man. Jimmy Breslin wrote The Gang That Can't Shoot Straight. Graham Greene wrote Travels with My Aunt. Dee Brown wrote Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And James Dickey wrote Deliverance. If you were born in 1971, the number 5 book was The Betsy by Harold Robbins. And number 4 was The Day of the Jackal by Frederick Forsyth. The number 3 book was The Passions of the Mind by Irving Stone. At number 2, William P. Blatty wrote The Exorcist. Now I want to stop and tell you just a quick story about The Exorcist. When the movie came out several years later, I was in college and I wanted to go see it, but there were stories about the devil and the exorcism and things that happened in the movie theater. So I was nervous about it. Like, it seems ridiculous now, but at the time I was nervous about it. And I was involved with a Catholic group in college, and honestly, I don't know why I was involved with them because I'm not Catholic, but anyway, I was. So I went to the movie with this Catholic group with a priest, and I made sure I sat next to the priest just in case. Okay, so number 1 book for 1971, Arthur Haley wrote Wheels. If you were born in 1972, the number 5 book was The Winds of War by Herman Wouk. At number 4, Irving Wallace wrote The Word. At number 3, Frederick Forsyth wrote The Odessa File. At number 2, August 1914 was written by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And the number 1 book of 1972 was Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach. Also published in 1972, Hunter S. Thompson wrote Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And Danielle Steel's debut novel was published. It was called Going Home. If you were born in 1973, the number 5 book was Evening in Byzantium by Irwin Shaw. The number 4 book was The Hollow Hills by Mary Stewart. At number 3, Gore Vidal wrote Burr. The number 2 book is Kurt Vonnegut, Breakfast of Champions. And the number 1 book for 1973, Once Is Not Enough by Jacqueline Suzanne. Also published in 1973, Robert Ludlum wrote The Matlock Paper, and Toni Morrison wrote Sula. If you were born in 1974, the number 5 book for that year was Joseph Heller, Something Happened. The number 4 book was Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by John le Carré. At number 3, Peter Benchley wrote Jaws. The number 2 book was Richard Adams with Watership Down. And the number 1 book for 1974 was Centennial by James A. Michener. Also published in 1974, Ursula K. Le Guin wrote The Dispossessed, and Stephen King's debut novel was published. It was Carrie. Now, this was the 4th novel he had written, but the first to be published. If you were born in 1975, the number 5 book was The Choir Boys by Joseph Wambaugh. At number 4, Judith Rosner wrote Looking for Mr. Goodbar. Agatha Christie is at number 3 with Curtain. The number 2 book is The Money Changers by Alex Haley. And the number 1 book for 1975 is Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow. Also published in 1975, James Clavell wrote Shogun, Jack Higgins wrote The Eagle Has Landed, and Michael Crichton wrote The Great Train Robbery. If you were born in 1976, the number 5 book was The Deep by Peter Benchley. And number 4, Jack Higgins wrote Storm Warning. Number 3 is Jekyll and Suzanne, Dolores. Agatha Christie is at number 2 with Sleeping Murder. And the number 1 book in 1976 was Trinity by Leon Uris. Also published in 1976, Gore Vidal wrote 1876. And Rice wrote Interview with a Vampire, and Alex Haley published Roots. Roots won a special Pulitzer Prize. A few years later, it was made into a television miniseries, but when the executives saw the miniseries, they got cold feet, and they were sure it was going to be a money loser. So they decided, instead of showing it over 8 consecutive weeks, they would show it in 8 consecutive days, and it was just to get it over with. It was a huge success. They reached an unprecedented 130 million viewers, and from that point forward, all miniseries became sequential nights rather than as a weekly series. So it all started with Roots. If you were born in 1977, the number 5 book was Oliver's Story by Eric Siegel. At number 4, The Honorable Schoolboy by John le Carré. The number 3 book was by Richard Bach, Illusions, The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah. The number 2 book was Thornbirds by Colleen McCulloch. And the number 1 book for 1977 was The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. Also published in 1977, Stephen King wrote The Shining, Toni Morrison wrote Song of Solomon, and Anais Nin wrote Delta of Venus. If you were born in 1978, the number 5 book was Scruples by Judith Krantz. Sidney Sheldon was at number 4 with Bloodlines. The number 3 book was Fools Die by Mario Puzo. The number 2 book was War and Remembrance by Henry Woke. And the number 1 book for 1978, James A. Michener's Chesapeake. Also published in 1978, Belva Plain wrote Evergreen, and John Irving wrote The World According to Garp. If you were born in 1979, the number 5 book was Jailbird by Kurt Vonnegut. At number 4, Harold Robbins wrote Memories of Another Day. The number 3 book was Overload by Arthur Haley. At number 2, William Styron wrote Sophie's Choice. And the number 1 book for 1979 was Robert Ludlum's The Matteries Circle. Also published in 1979, John le Carré wrote Smiley's People. Norman Mailer wrote The Executioner's Song. Douglas Adams wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Octavia Butler wrote Kindred, and Stephen King wrote The Dead Zone. So you can see there were a lot of really great books that came out in this decade. If you were born in the 70s, what do you think about the books that came out in the year you were born? If you weren't born in the 70s, and that's probably most of you, have you read any of these books? Please let me know. Leave a comment below. I would love to hear from you. The next video in this series is going to go back to the 60s. Thank you for watching.